The metal beam crashed down, tearing through fabric like paper, and every man on the construction site froze mid-breath. Bill McKinley lay pinned beneath the scaffold, his work shirt shredded, revealing what he'd hidden for 3 agonizing years. It wasn't just a shoulder bump. It was a grotesque, festering mass the size of a softball. Young Martinez dropped his hammer and stumbled backward, retching. Old Pete, who'd seen Vietnam carnage, went white as sheet metal. The foreman's hands shook so violently he could barely dial 911. Dorothy McKinley had kissed that shoulder goodnight for 37 years of marriage, never knowing what lurked beneath those long-sleeved shirts. The same shoulder she'd massaged during thunderstorms, now a nightmare of discolored flesh and putrid decay. "Jesus Christ, get an ambulance now!" Thomas screamed, his medical training battling his horror as a son. How long had his father been dying in silence? And what else had the McKinley family missed while Bill suffered alone in his garage, night after torturous night? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the McKinley household hummed with the comfortable rhythms of a 37-year marriage. William "Bill" McKinley, 67 and built like the construction supervisor he'd been for 4 decades, stood in his garage at dawn, coffee mug steaming in the Arizona chill. The Chevelle 69 sat before him like an old friend, its cherry-red paint job a testament to countless weekend hours spent with calloused hands and infinite patience. "Dorothy, hand me that socket wrench, will you?" he called toward the kitchen window, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded respect on job sites across 3 states. When his wife appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron from morning biscuits, Bill instinctively shifted his right shoulder away from her reaching hand. Dorothy "Dot" McKinley had spent 30 years as a VA nurse before retiring, her gentle touch having comforted countless wounded soldiers. At 65, she moved through their ranch-style home with the efficiency of someone who'd managed emergency rooms and family dinners with equal skill. Her silver hair caught the morning light as she handed him the tool, her fingers briefly brushing his forearm. She noticed how he pulled back just slightly, but filed it away with all the other small changes she'd observed in her husband over the past months. Their sons had grown into men who carried the McKinley name with different interpretations of strength. Thomas, 41, and an emergency room physician in Phoenix, visited monthly with his wife and 2 children, his conversations peppered with medical terminology and the controlled chaos of hospital life. James, 38 and running his own auto repair shop 20 minutes down the road, stopped by most evenings, his work boots tracking desert dust across Dorothy's clean floors as he updated his father on local gossip and shared a beer on the back porch. The McKinley home stood as a monument to middle-class American persistence, mortgage paid off in 1998, vegetable garden that fed half the neighborhood, and walls lined with photographs spanning 4 decades. Bill's bronze star hung in the living room beside their wedding portrait, both symbols of battles won through determination and faith. The neighborhood itself reflected their values: retired teachers, former railroad workers, and other Vietnam veterans who'd built their version of the American dream in the Arizona desert. But beneath the surface of coffee-scented mornings and grandchildren's laughter, something had shifted. Bill's long-sleeved shirts in 100-degree heat, his increased consumption of over-the-counter pain relievers, the way he favored his left side when lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup. Dorothy's nursing instincts whispered warnings she couldn't quite articulate, while her wife's heart hoped she was imagining problems that didn't exist. The small bump on Bill's right shoulder, discovered during a shower 3 years prior, had grown from the size of a marble to something more concerning. Yet, in a household built on the foundation of a man who'd survived the jungles of Southeast Asia, discussing weakness felt like betraying everything the McKinley name represented. The first sign that something had fundamentally shifted in the McKinley household came on a Tuesday morning in late March when Dorothy found a blood-stained undershirt buried deep in the laundry hamper. She held the cotton fabric up to the kitchen window, studying the rust-colored stains that formed an irregular pattern across the right shoulder area. 30 years of nursing had taught her to read the stories that bodies told through such evidence, and this particular narrative made her stomach clench with recognition. Bill emerged from his morning shower, steam trailing behind him as he reached for the coffee pot with his left hand. His right arm hung closer to his body than usual, and Dorothy noticed how he turned away when she approached with his favorite mug. The small intimacies of marriage, the casual touches, the shared space around the bathroom sink had gradually eroded over recent weeks, replaced by careful choreography that kept his right side shielded from her view. "Honey, you've been favoring that shoulder for weeks now," Dorothy said, setting his coffee on the counter within reach of his good arm. Her voice carried the practiced neutrality she'd used with difficult patients. But her eyes searched his face for tells. Bill's response came too quickly, rehearsed. "Just an old war wound acting up, Dot. Nothing a little ibuprofen won't fix." He moved toward the garage with the determination of a man fleeing interrogation, leaving Dorothy alone with her growing certainty that whatever was happening to her husband went far beyond old war wounds. The evidence accumulated like drops of water, eventually forming a flood. She found empty bottles of extra-strength pain relievers hidden behind paint cans in the garage. His computer browser history, discovered during her attempt to pay bills online, revealed late-night searches for shoulder lumps, skin cancer symptoms, and when to see a doctor. Each search had been quickly deleted, but Dorothy's determination matched her husband's secrecy. Easter Sunday brought the extended McKinley clan together for their traditional backyard barbecue, and Dorothy watched her husband perform the role of family patriarch with increasing desperation. Thomas arrived with his wife Sarah and their 2 young children, his physician's eye immediately cataloging his father's careful movements and diminished range of motion. James pulled up in his work truck, diesel engine rattling, and embraced his father with the bear hug that had become their standard greeting since boyhood. But Dorothy saw how Bill winced, how his right hand barely participated in the embrace, how he guided James's arms away from his problematic shoulder with subtle but deliberate movements. The family gathering that should have felt like celebration instead buzzed with unspoken tensions and careful observations. "Dad, when's the last time you had a proper physical?" Thomas asked during dinner, his question seemingly casual but weighted with professional concern. The emergency room doctor in him recognized pain management behaviors, the slight lean away from contact, the preference for his non-dominant hand in routine tasks. Bill's laugh carried forced heartiness. "Son, I've been poked and prodded enough for 3 lifetimes. This old body's got plenty of miles left on it." He deflected with stories from Vietnam, tales of endurance and brotherhood that had always served as conversational armor when family discussions ventured into uncomfortable territory. James, loyal to their father's philosophy of self-reliance, supported the deflection. "Leave Dad alone, Tommy. He's tougher than all of us combined. Remember when he worked 3 days with that broken rib back in '85? The brothers' opposing philosophies, Thomas's medical training versus James's blue-collar respect for stoic endurance, created a familiar dynamic that allowed Bill to escape further scrutiny. But Dorothy had reached her breaking point. At 3 in the morning, unable to sleep beside her restless husband, she found Bill sitting in his workshop, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The sight of her powerful, unbreakable husband crying in the darkness shattered something fundamental in her understanding of their marriage. "William McKinley, in 43 years I've never seen you cry," she whispered, settling beside him on the workbench where he'd taught their boys to use tools and shared countless quiet conversations over the decades. His response emerged through tears that seemed to surprise him with their intensity. A man's got a right to hurt in private, Dot. Some things, some things you just bear. The admission hung between them like a confession, revealing years of accumulated pain that had been carefully hidden behind long sleeves and forced smiles. Dorothy's nursing instincts battled with her role as wife, professional knowledge warring with personal respect for her husband's autonomy. She understood that pushing too hard might drive him further into isolation, yet every medical instinct screamed that time was running out. The compromise they reached felt inadequate. Bill's promise to keep an eye on it against Dorothy's growing certainty that whatever was growing beneath those long sleeves was far beyond the reach of wishful thinking and over-the-counter remedies. The secret that had begun as a small bump 3 years earlier had metastasized into something that threatened not just Bill's body, but the very foundation of their family's carefully constructed normalcy. The turning point arrived disguised as a gift, wrapped in Thomas's guilt over years of missed Sunday dinners and hurried phone calls from hospital break rooms. In late April, he appeared at his parents' front door with architectural blueprints tucked under his arm and the nervous excitement of a son trying to compensate for emotional absence with grand gestures. "I want to add a master bedroom suite," Thomas announced, spreading the plans across Dorothy's kitchen table. "Bigger bathroom, walk-in closet, sitting area where you can watch the sunrise." His finger traced the proposed addition, a generous extension that would double their living space and, more importantly in his mind, demonstrate the love he struggled to express in daily phone calls. Bill studied the blueprints with the critical eye of someone who'd supervised construction crews for 4 decades. Despite the constant ache in his shoulder that had progressed from occasional discomfort to relentless throbbing, his professional pride flared at the sight of his son's ambitious plans. "This is good work, Tommy. Real good work. But you're not paying some contractor to build on my house. A man builds his own home. That's been true since before America was America." Dorothy watched her husband's face transform as he examined the drawings, seeing past the pain medication haze to the skilled craftsman who'd built half the additions in their neighborhood. For the first time in months, Bill looked truly alive, his mind calculating load-bearing walls and electrical runs with the precision that had made him legendary on job sites across Arizona. James arrived that evening, work boots heavy on the front porch, and found his father and brother hunched over the kitchen table in animated discussion about foundation requirements and permit applications. The sight of his family united in planning stirred something protective in the younger son, who'd always been closer to home, more attuned to the subtle shifts in his parents' daily rhythms. "Count me in," James declared, settling into the chair that had been his since childhood. "I've got 2 weeks' vacation saved up, and Tommy here needs someone who knows the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver." The gentle ribbing between brothers carried affection earned through decades of shared holidays and competing for their father's approval. Thomas's medical training screamed warnings as he observed his father's careful movements, the way Bill favored his left side when reaching for tools, the slight tremor in his right hand that suggested either pain or medication side effects. But the emergency room physician found himself overruled by the son who desperately wanted to believe his father's assurances that everything was manageable, treatable with ibuprofen and stubborn determination. The construction project became Bill's obsession, a final proving ground for the physical capabilities he felt slipping away. Each morning, he arrived at the worksite before dawn, thermos of coffee in his left hand, tool belt hanging awkwardly around his waist as he avoided straps that might press against his problematic shoulder. The neighborhood veterans who'd volunteered their labor, men who'd shared foxholes and bar stools over the decades, noticed his diminished strength, but respected the unspoken code that protected a man's dignity in the face of aging bodies and failing health. Dorothy established herself as the project's unofficial supervisor, bringing sandwiches and ice water while conducting her own surveillance of her husband's condition. She watched him struggle with tasks that had once been automatic, saw him disappear into the garage during lunch breaks where she suspected he was taking increasingly frequent doses of pain medication. Her nursing experience recognized the signs of someone managing chronic pain through willpower and pharmaceutical intervention, a dangerous combination that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The physical deterioration accelerated under the demands of construction work. What had begun as a golf ball-sized bump beneath Bill's shirt had grown to the size of a lemon, creating a visible distortion that even his carefully chosen clothing couldn't completely disguise. The skin around the growth had taken on an alarming discoloration, patches of red and purple that spoke of infection and poor circulation. More troubling was the smell, a sweet, sickly odor that Bill masked with increased cologne usage and strategic positioning to keep the wind at his back. James began noticing his father's decreased appetite, the way Bill pushed food around his plate during their evening meals, claiming the Arizona heat had killed his hunger. The man who'd once consumed Dorothy's pot roast like a teenager now seemed to exist on coffee and determination, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that was shrinking before their eyes. The near-miss incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon when the Arizona sun had turned the construction site into a furnace. Bill had insisted on operating the circular saw, despite James's offers to handle the more demanding tasks. And Dorothy found him 20 minutes later, unconscious on the garage floor, the saw blade still spinning inches from his head. "Dad! Dad!" James's voice carried panic as he dropped beside his father, checking for injuries, while his mind raced through possible explanations. Bill's skin felt clammy and feverish, his breathing shallow and irregular. For terrifying moments, James thought he might be watching his father die on the concrete floor where they'd shared countless conversations about cars, women, and the mysteries of adult responsibility. Bill regained consciousness with the disorientation of someone fighting both pain medication and physical exhaustion. "Just got dizzy from the heat," he mumbled, accepting James's help to sit up while avoiding any movement that might reveal the extent of his shoulder's deterioration. "Your mother worries enough without knowing about every little dizzy spell." That evening, James called Thomas from his truck in the hospital parking lot, his hands shaking as he described finding their father unconscious. The brothers' conversation lasted 2 hours, medical expertise clashing with blue-collar loyalty as they debated intervention strategies and family dynamics. Both men understood they were approaching a crisis point, but neither wanted to be the son who betrayed their father's trust by forcing medical attention he clearly didn't want. The construction project that had begun as a gesture of love was becoming a race against time, with Bill determined to prove his continued usefulness while his body deteriorated beneath layers of denial and long-sleeved shirts. The family conspiracy began in whispered phone calls between Thomas and James, medical terminology clashing with blue-collar directness as the brothers navigated the delicate balance between respecting their father's autonomy and preventing what both increasingly feared was a medical catastrophe waiting to happen. Thomas approached the situation with clinical precision, researching symptoms and consulting colleagues at Phoenix General, while James relied on instinct and the intimate knowledge that came from sharing beer and conversation with their father 3 evenings a week. Dorothy became their reluctant ally after James cornered her in the grocery store parking lot, his usual easy smile replaced by the grim expression of someone who'd spent sleepless nights watching his father deteriorate. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad," he said, loading her groceries with hands that shook slightly. "And I mean really talk, Not the way we've been dancing around this thing for months." The conversation that followed in Dorothy's kitchen revealed the extent of their shared knowledge and mounting fears. Thomas had documented his father's symptoms with medical precision: the limited range of motion, the careful positioning to avoid contact, the increased reliance on over-the-counter pain medication. James contributed observations from their daily interactions: the way Bill had stopped working on the Chevelle, his decreased appetite, the nights when James arrived to find his father sitting motionless in the garage, staring at tools he no longer had the strength to wield effectively. Dorothy's revelations shocked both sons. She'd been conducting her own investigation for months, driven by nursing instincts that recognized the progression of something far more serious than her husband's casual explanations could account for. The blood-stained clothing hidden throughout the house, the antiseptic smell that clung to Bill's work shirts, the way he'd begun sleeping in his recliner rather than their shared bed, details that painted a picture of systematic concealment and escalating medical crisis. "He's scared," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the weight of 37 years of marriage to a man who'd built his identity around physical strength and emotional stoicism. "William McKinley has faced down Viet Cong soldiers and job site accidents that would hospitalize most men, but he's terrified of being seen as weak, as someone who needs taking care of." The brothers' approach to intervention reflected their different relationships with their father. Thomas wanted to stage a medical intervention, using his professional credentials to force a hospital visit and comprehensive examination. His emergency room experience had taught him that delayed treatment often meant the difference between manageable conditions and terminal diagnoses, and every day of continued avoidance increased the potential for irreversible complications. James advocated for a more subtle approach, understanding that their father would retreat further if he felt cornered or betrayed. "Dad doesn't respond to pressure," he argued during their late-night planning sessions. "Remember when he quit smoking? Nobody could make him do it until he decided for himself. We push too hard, and he'll lock himself in that garage and refuse to come out." Meanwhile, Bill's isolation deepened as the physical demands of the construction project exceeded his diminished capabilities. The master bedroom addition that had initially energized him now felt like a monument to his declining strength, each day revealing new tasks that required help he was too proud to request. His workshop became his refuge, the space where he could examine his deteriorating shoulder in private, probing the growth that had developed its own disturbing characteristics. The mass had evolved beyond a simple bump into something that defied his attempts at self-diagnosis. The skin around the growth had taken on a mottled appearance, areas of red and purple that radiated heat and emanated a smell that no amount of cologne could mask. Touching the area produced a sickening sensation of movement beneath the skin, as if the thing had developed its own internal structure that responded to pressure with unsettling flexibility. Bill's coping mechanisms had progressed from occasional ibuprofen to a carefully scheduled regimen of over-the-counter pain relievers supplemented with small amounts of whiskey that he told himself were purely medicinal. The combination provided temporary relief but left him functioning in a pharmaceutical haze that made concentration difficult and emotional control nearly impossible. The Vietnam memories that had always lurked in the background of his consciousness now emerged with increasing frequency, particularly during the long nights when pain made sleep elusive. He found himself reliving moments from 1968, the weight of wounded comrades he'd carried through jungle terrain, the promise he'd made to surviving squad members that they would all take care of their own. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd refused to leave wounded soldiers behind was now determined to bear his own suffering in isolation. Dorothy's own isolation grew as she watched her husband retreat into a private hell she wasn't allowed to enter. Her nursing background provided clinical understanding of what might be happening, but her role as wife demanded she respect boundaries that her professional instincts screamed were dangerous. The woman who'd comforted countless families through medical crises found herself helpless in the face of her husband's stubborn pride. Her secret research into insurance coverage and treatment options revealed the financial fears that likely contributed to Bill's avoidance of medical care. Their VA benefits covered basic needs but would struggle with the costs of complex procedures, and their retirement savings, carefully accumulated over decades, could disappear rapidly in the face of serious illness. Dorothy began making discreet inquiries about second mortgages and medical loans, preparing for financial decisions she hoped they'd never need to make. The community that had always provided support and connection began to reflect Bill's withdrawal. Poker nights with fellow veterans became irregular, then stopped entirely. Church attendance, once as reliable as sunrise, became sporadic as Bill claimed various minor ailments that kept him home. Even the neighborhood informal network of retirees who gathered for morning coffee and afternoon gossip noticed Bill's absence from their casual social interactions. Pastor Williams made a house call that Dorothy had requested without her husband's knowledge, arriving with the gentle persistence of someone experienced in reaching men who'd forgotten how to ask for help. The conversation in Bill's workshop lasted over an hour, two veterans of different wars discussing the challenges of carrying invisible wounds in a world that expected strength without vulnerability. "William, I've counseled a lot of soldiers over the years," the pastor said, his hands examining the tools that lined the workshop walls. "The strongest ones aren't the men who never fall down. They're the ones who know when to let their brothers help them back up." Bill's response carried the weariness of someone fighting battles on multiple fronts. "Pastor, I've been carrying my own weight for 67 years. I don't know how to be the one who needs carrying." The construction project continued with increasing surrealism as Bill insisted on participating despite obvious physical limitations. James and Thomas took turns supervising their father, intervening when tasks exceeded his capabilities while maintaining the fiction that his contributions remained essential. The work that should have taken 2 weeks stretched into a month as progress slowed to accommodate Bill's need to rest frequently and avoid activities that might expose his condition. Dorothy established herself as the project's documentary photographer, her camera capturing moments that later would serve as evidence of how much they'd all seen without allowing themselves to truly understand. Pictures of Bill in long sleeves during 100-degree days, images of him working exclusively with his left hand, shots where his careful positioning kept his right side away from the camera's view. The emotional toll on the family created new tensions and unexpected alliances. Thomas's medical training made him hypersensitive to symptoms and potential complications, leading to arguments with James over intervention strategies. Dorothy found herself mediating between her sons while managing her own fear and frustration. The woman who'd always been the family's emotional center now struggling to maintain equilibrium as their carefully constructed normalcy collapsed around them. The breaking point approached with the inevitability of a storm system gathering strength across the desert, all the family's careful navigation and respectful boundaries about to be shattered by circumstances that would make denial impossible and delay potentially fatal. The morning of the accident dawned with the merciless heat that made Arizona summers legendary, the thermometer climbing past 100 degrees before most people finished their breakfast coffee. Bill McKinley stood in his garage at 5:30, earlier than usual, studying the construction materials that would frame the final wall of Thomas's master bedroom addition. Today's work would require heavy lifting and precise coordination, tasks that demanded the kind of physical capability he'd once taken for granted, but now approached with the careful calculation of someone managing resources that were rapidly diminishing. Dorothy found him there an hour later, fully dressed in his standard uniform of long-sleeved work shirt and jeans despite weather forecasts, predicting temperatures that would reach 115 degrees. The sight of her husband preparing for another day of construction work in such heat filled her with the familiar dread that had become her constant companion over recent months, the nursing professional in her recognizing signs of someone pushing far beyond safe physical limits. "Bill, honey, maybe you should supervise today instead of doing the heavy work," she suggested, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she'd perfected when approaching subjects that might trigger his defensive responses. "It's going to be brutal out there, and the boys can handle the physical stuff." His response carried the forced cheerfulness that had become his standard deflection technique. "Dot, I've worked construction in this desert for 40 years. A little heat never killed a McKinley." But Dorothy noticed how he avoided meeting her eyes, and how his right hand remained carefully positioned at his side, the arm that had once swung freely, now held in a posture that suggested constant protection of something fragile and painful. Thomas arrived at 7 sharp, his physician's schedule allowing him to participate in construction work only on carefully arranged days when hospital coverage permitted his absence. He brought coffee for everyone, and the focused energy of someone trying to complete a project that had taken on significance far beyond its original purpose. The master bedroom addition had evolved from a simple gift into a race against time, though none of them would have articulated their urgency in such dramatic terms. James pulled up 30 minutes later, his diesel truck rattling in the morning stillness as he unloaded tools and materials with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades turning raw materials into functional structures. The 3 McKinley men stood together in the backyard, surveying the day's work with the ritual solemnity that construction projects seemed to demand, each carrying private fears about whether this would be the day their carefully maintained fiction finally collapsed. The scaffold system that would support the day's work had been erected the previous evening, a temporary framework of metal pipes and wooden platforms that would allow access to the upper portions of the new wall. James had insisted on double-checking all connections, his mechanical background making him naturally cautious about structural integrity, but the Arizona heat was already making the metal components uncomfortably hot to touch by 8 in the morning. Bill positioned himself at the crucial junction where heavy beams would need to be guided into place, a task that required someone with experience to ensure proper alignment and safety. His insistence on taking this role reflected both his genuine expertise and his desperate need to remain essential to the project's success, even as his physical capabilities diminished with each passing day. The accident occurred with the sudden inevitability that characterizes most construction site injuries, a convergence of environmental stress, equipment limitations, and human factors that created a perfect storm of dangerous circumstances. The scaffold system, stressed by the morning's thermal expansion and the weight of materials, began to shift just as Bill was guiding a heavy support beam into position. James, working below his father, noticed the instability first. The younger man's mechanical instincts recognized the subtle sounds that indicated structural failure, the tiny pops and creaks that preceded catastrophic collapse. His shout of warning came simultaneously with his reflexive movement toward his father's position, protective instincts overriding personal safety considerations. The beam that broke free weighed nearly 200 pounds, a mass of seasoned lumber that had been destined to support the master bedroom's ceiling. As it began to fall toward James, Bill's reaction came from depths of protective instinct that bypassed conscious thought, the same reflexes that had saved wounded soldiers in Vietnamese jungles 40 years earlier. Bill threw himself between the falling beam and his son, his body absorbing the impact that would have crushed James against the concrete foundation. The collision tore through his work shirt like tissue paper, the fabric that had concealed his secret for 3 agonizing years, finally surrendering to forces beyond his control. The exposure was total and immediate. The mass on Bill's shoulder, revealed in the harsh Arizona sunlight, defied every euphemism and careful description the family had used to avoid confronting its reality. What had begun as a simple bump had evolved into something that seemed to belong in a medical textbook's most disturbing chapters, a grotesque distortion of human anatomy that spoke of months of infection, neglect, and systematic concealment. Thomas's medical training provided clinical vocabulary for what they were seeing, but his identity as a son made the sight almost impossible to process. The emergency room physician who'd treated countless trauma cases found himself immobilized by the revelation that his father had been carrying this burden in silence, dying incrementally while maintaining the fiction that everything was manageable. James's reaction was more immediate and visceral. The man who'd worshipped his father's physical strength, who'd built his own identity around the McKinley family reputation for toughness and self-reliance, dropped to his knees beside Bill's motionless form and began to sob with the abandon of someone whose foundational beliefs had just collapsed. The construction workers who'd volunteered their time, neighborhood veterans who'd shared foxholes and bar stools with Bill over decades of friendship, reacted with the stunned silence of men confronting their own mortality reflected in their buddies' suffering. Pete Gonzalez, who'd seen combat casualties in 3 different wars, stepped backward until he encountered the fence, his face pale with recognition of something that transcended normal expectations of age-related decline. Dorothy's scream from the kitchen window carried across the neighborhood with the primal force of someone whose worst fears had been realized in a single moment. The woman who'd spent 30 years comforting other families through medical crises found herself racing across the backyard toward a scene that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The emergency response that followed seemed to occur in slow motion, each decision weighted with the knowledge that years of avoidance and denial had finally culminated in a moment that would change everything. Thomas's medical credentials gave him authority to coordinate care, but his emotional state made professional detachment nearly impossible as he knelt beside his father and tried to process the extent of what had been hidden from their family. The sound of sirens in the distance marked the end of secrecy and the beginning of a reckoning that would test every assumption the McKinley family had maintained about strength, pride, and the obligations that bind families together through the most impossible circumstances. The emergency room at Tucson Medical Center became the stage for the McKinley family's complete emotional collapse, sterile walls and fluorescent lighting providing an unforgiving backdrop for confrontations that had been years in the making. Bill lay on the examination table, his secret finally exposed under the harsh medical lighting, while his family struggled to process the magnitude of what he'd hidden from them and the potential consequences of his stubborn silence. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending emergency physician, had seen countless cases of delayed medical care during her 15 years in Tucson's busiest trauma center, but the extent of Bill's condition challenged even her professional composure. The mass on his shoulder had progressed far beyond anything that should have been managed outside a medical facility, showing clear signs of severe infection, tissue necrosis, and systemic involvement that made immediate surgical intervention not just advisable, but absolutely critical. Mr. McKinley, I need to understand how long you've been managing this condition, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the controlled urgency that emergency physicians use when every minute matters. The infection appears to have progressed to a point where we're looking at potential sepsis, and there are signs that the surrounding tissue has been compromised for an extended period. Bill's response, weakened by pain and the shock of exposure, carried the defiance that had sustained him through 3 years of secret suffering. It's not as bad as it looks, Doc. I've been keeping it clean, taking care of it myself. Just need some antibiotics, maybe some stronger pain pills. Thomas stood beside his father's bed, his medical training warring with his emotional devastation as he translated the clinical observations into terms that made his blood run cold. "Dad, you're looking at potential amputation," he said, his voice breaking on words he'd never imagined speaking to his own father. "The infection has compromised so much tissue that saving the shoulder might not even be possible." The word amputation hit the family like a physical blow. Dorothy, who'd maintained her composure through decades of medical emergencies involving other people's families, crumbled against the wall, her sobs echoing off the hospital corridor walls with the raw grief of someone confronting the possibility of losing the man she'd loved for nearly 4 decades. James's reaction was more explosive, his blue-collar directness providing no buffer for the sophisticated emotional processing that the situation demanded. 3 fucking years! He screamed, his voice carrying through the emergency department with enough force to bring security personnel running. 3 years you've been dying and you didn't trust us enough to help you. The financial consultation that followed added another layer of crisis to an already overwhelming situation. Bill's VA benefits would cover basic care, but the complex surgical procedures required to address his condition would cost upwards of $60,000, money the family didn't have and couldn't easily obtain. Dorothy found herself discussing second mortgages and payment plans while her husband lay sedated in preparation for emergency surgery, the practical concerns of medical bankruptcy competing with immediate fears about his survival. The waiting room became a purgatory of recriminations and revelations as the family confronted 3 years of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs. Thomas tortured himself with professional knowledge of early intervention protocols, calculating how different the outcome might have been if his father had sought treatment when the condition first appeared. His medical training provided detailed understanding of the progression they were facing, knowledge that made his father's delays seem not just stubborn, but actively suicidal. "I'm an emergency room physician," Thomas said to James during one of their pacing circuits around the hospital's family waiting area. "I treat people every day who've waited too long to seek help, and I completely miss the signs in my own father. What kind of doctor does that make me? What kind of son?" James's response carried the bitter recognition of someone whose worship of paternal strength had contributed to the very crisis they were facing. "You want to know what kind of son you are? You're the son who respected Dad enough to believe he could take care of himself. We all did. We enabled this because we bought into his tough guy act, and now look where we are." Dorothy's emotional breakdown in the hospital chapel attracted the attention of Pastor Williams, who'd driven across town as soon as news of the crisis reached their church community. The pastor found her collapsed in the front pew, her faith shaken by the realization that her husband had been suffering alone while she slept beside him night after night, unaware of the battle he was fighting in silence. "I held dying soldiers' hands for 10 years at the VA hospital," Dorothy sobbed, her words barely comprehensible through tears that seemed to come from depths she didn't know existed. "I could have helped him. I had the medical knowledge, the nursing experience, the connections to get him proper care. And he didn't trust me enough to let me save him." The community response to news of Bill's crisis revealed the extent to which his struggle had been conducted in isolation, neighbors and fellow veterans expressing shock at the severity of a condition they'd never suspected. The men who'd worked alongside him on the construction project, who'd shared coffee and conversation without detecting the magnitude of his suffering, found themselves questioning their own awareness of the people closest to them. Pete Gonzalez visited the hospital that evening, his weathered hands shaking as he tried to find words for the guilt he felt about missing his friend's deteriorating condition. "Bill and I served together in Vietnam," he told Dorothy in the hospital corridor. "We promised we'd watch out for each other, that we'd never let a buddy suffer alone. I failed him. We all failed him." The surgical consultation that took place at midnight brought the family face to face with decisions they'd never imagined having to make. Dr. Martinez, the trauma surgeon who would attempt to save Bill's shoulder, presented options that ranged from aggressive limb preservation to immediate amputation, each choice carrying risks that could prove fatal given the extent of infection and Bill's overall health status. Your husband's condition has progressed to the point where we're making decisions about quality of life versus quantity of life, Dr. Martinez explained with the careful precision of someone who'd delivered similar news to countless families. The infection has spread into his bloodstream, and every hour of delay increases the risk of systemic shutdown. We need your consent for procedures that might save his life but could leave him permanently disabled. The consent forms that Dorothy signed with trembling hands felt like death warrants for the life they'd built together, legal documents that marked the end of their carefully maintained normalcy and the beginning of a future that might not include the man who'd been her anchor for 37 years. The signature that had marked mortgage papers and children's school forms now authorized procedures that could change everything about their remaining years together. As Bill was wheeled into surgery at 2 in the morning, the family that had gathered to build a master bedroom addition found themselves instead confronting the possibility that their patriarch might not survive to see its completion. The first revelation came at dawn, delivered by Dr. Martinez with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years learning how to transform medical complexity into language that families could understand without being completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. The McKinley family, exhausted from a sleepless night in surgical waiting rooms, gathered around the surgeon like survivors of a shipwreck, listening for news of rescue. "The mass on your husband's shoulder isn't cancerous," Dr. Martinez announced, his words cutting through the family's exhausted despair with unexpected hope. "What we found during surgery was a severe infection surrounding a foreign object, specifically metal fragments that appear to have been embedded for decades, likely from military service." The revelation hit Thomas first, his medical training allowing him to process the implications faster than his emotional state could accommodate. "You mean all this time Dad's been suffering from something that could have been treated?" he asked, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone recalculating years of assumptions and missed opportunities. "Doctor." Martinez nodded, pulling up X-ray images on his tablet that showed the ghostly outline of shrapnel fragments embedded deep in Bill's shoulder tissue. "These fragments have been there for probably 40 years or more, slowly causing irritation and inflammation. Over time, the body's immune response created a chronic infection that finally overwhelmed his system's ability to cope." Dorothy stared at the X-ray images with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 3 decades interpreting medical data, her nursing background allowing her to understand the cruel irony of what they were seeing. "The Purple Heart he never got," she whispered, her fingers tracing the outline of metal fragments that had been slowly killing her husband while he carried the weight of survival guilt from a war that had officially ended decades ago. But the medical relief was tempered by Dr. Martinez's continued explanation of the surgical challenges they'd faced during the 6-hour procedure. "The delay in treatment created significant complications," he explained, his professional demeanor softening as he addressed a family that had already endured more emotional trauma than most people face in a lifetime. "We were able to remove the foreign objects and clean out the infected tissue, but the shoulder joint itself has been severely damaged. Your husband will likely have permanent limitations in range of motion and strength." James's reaction to this news reflected his practical understanding of what such limitations would mean for a man who'd defined himself through physical capability for 67 years. "He'll never be able to work construction again, will he?" he asked, the question carrying implications that extended far beyond employment into fundamental questions of identity and purpose. The second revelation emerged during Bill's recovery from anesthesia when pain medication and surgical stress combined to lower the emotional barriers he'd maintained for decades. Thomas sat beside his father's hospital bed, listening to rambling confessions that revealed the psychological warfare Bill had been fighting alongside his physical battle. "I was supposed to die over there," Bill mumbled, his words slurred but carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that had shaped 40 years of his emotional landscape. "Tommy Rodriguez, Mike Chen, half my squad, they didn't make it home. And here I am complaining about a little pain when they never got the chance to grow old with their wives." The confession continued in fragments over several hours, revealing the complex psychology that had driven Bill's refusal to seek medical care. In his mind, seeking treatment for the very wounds that had killed his comrades felt like betraying their sacrifice, as if acknowledging his own suffering diminished the magnitude of their loss. Dorothy listened to these revelations with the heartbreak of someone discovering that her husband's love for his fallen brothers had nearly cost her the chance to grow old with the man she'd devoted her life to supporting. "William, those boys didn't die so you could suffer in silence," she whispered, her voice carrying 37 years of accumulated love and frustration. "They died hoping their sacrifice would mean something, and you living a full life honors them more than dying slowly in a garage." The third revelation came from an unexpected source, Pastor Williams, who arrived at the hospital carrying a manila envelope that contained documents Bill had asked him to keep safe years earlier. The envelope held Bill's original military medical records, papers that revealed a young soldier's pride had prevented him from reporting shrapnel wounds that medics had deemed non-life-threatening during field treatment in 1968. "Your father came to me about 5 years ago," Pastor Williams explained to the assembled family, his voice carrying the weight of professional confidence violated only by the magnitude of the current crisis. He was researching his military records, trying to understand some health problems he was experiencing. These documents show that he received field treatment for shrapnel wounds, but never completed the paperwork for a Purple Heart because he was worried about being seen as weak by his unit. The military medical records painted a picture of a 19-year-old soldier whose pride and loyalty to his unit had prevented him from pursuing comprehensive treatment for wounds that would plague him for the rest of his life. The young Bill McKinley had accepted basic field dressing and returned to duty within hours, never allowing military doctors to conduct the thorough examination that might have detected and removed the metal fragments before they could cause decades of slow deterioration. Thomas studied the faded military documents with the fascination of someone solving a medical mystery that had claimed years of his father's life and nearly destroyed their family. "The Army doctors did exactly what they were supposed to do under field conditions," he explained to James and Dorothy. "But Dad never followed up with comprehensive care because he was too proud to admit he needed help, even at 19 years old." The financial revelation that accompanied these medical discoveries provided another layer of cruel irony to their situation. Dorothy's secret investigation into VA benefits revealed that Bill would have been eligible for comprehensive coverage of his condition if he'd ever applied for disability compensation related to his combat injuries. The very pride that had prevented him from seeking a Purple Heart had also cost him access to the medical care that could have addressed his condition years earlier. 40 years of available benefits that he never claimed because he didn't want to be seen as someone looking for government handouts, Dorothy explained to her sons, her voice carrying the exhausted frustration of someone who'd devoted years to supporting a man too proud to accept the support available to him. The community response to Bill's crisis created its own series of revelations about the hidden struggles carried by their neighbors and friends. As news of his condition spread through their veteran community, other men began coming forward with their own stories of delayed medical care, undisclosed injuries, and the psychological burden of survivor's guilt that had shaped their post-military lives. Pete Gonzalez visited Bill's hospital room carrying his own confession of medical neglect, revealing a series of skin cancers he'd been hiding from his family for fear of being seen as weak or demanding of attention. "I figured if Bill McKinley could handle his problems without complaining, I could handle mine," he admitted, the revelation opening conversations about masculinity and medical care that their generation had never been encouraged to have. The Veterans Support Network that emerged from Bill's crisis represented a fundamental shift in how their community approached health and wellness, with men who'd spent decades suffering in silence finally beginning to acknowledge that seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a responsibility to the families who loved them. Dr. Chen, who'd treated Bill in the emergency room, used his case as an educational opportunity for her medical students, demonstrating how cultural factors, economic concerns, and psychological barriers could combine to prevent people from seeking life-saving care even when resources were available. Mr. McKinley's case represents everything we need to understand about healthcare access in America, she explained to her residents. Insurance coverage, medical availability, and clinical expertise mean nothing if patients don't feel emotionally safe seeking care. As Bill began his long recovery process, the revelations continued to reshape his family's understanding of the man they thought they knew completely. Each new piece of information adding complexity to their appreciation of the psychological and physical battles he'd been fighting alone for decades. 3 months after the accident that changed everything, the McKinley household hummed with rhythms that were both familiar and completely transformed. Bill sat in his customized recliner on the completed master bedroom's sun-drenched patio, his right arm supported by a sling that had become as much a part of his daily uniform as the short-sleeve shirts he now wore without shame or concealment. The surgical scar that traced across his shoulder told a story of survival rather than defeat, a visible reminder of battles fought and won through the combined strength of medical intervention and family love. Dorothy moved through their expanded home with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd rediscovered her calling as a caregiver, her nursing skills, finding new application in her husband's rehabilitation process. The woman who'd spent 30 years comforting other families through medical crises now devoted herself to ensuring that Bill's recovery proceeded according to the strict protocols that would determine whether he regained meaningful function in his damaged arm. "Time for your exercises, Marine," Dorothy announced each morning at 9 sharp, her voice carrying the playful authority of someone who'd learned to transform medical necessity into expressions of love. The physical therapy routine that had initially felt like punishment to Bill had gradually evolved into their shared morning ritual, a time when Dorothy's professional expertise and wifely devotion combined to push him through the painful process of rebuilding strength and mobility. Thomas had restructured his work schedule to allow for weekly visits that combined family time with informal medical consultations, his emergency room experience providing valuable perspective on his father's recovery progress. The distance that had characterized their relationship for years had been replaced by conversations that acknowledged both his professional expertise and his emotional investment in his father's continued healing. "Dad, your range of motion has improved by 30 degrees since last month," Thomas reported during one of his weekend visits, his clinical observations carrying the enthusiasm of someone celebrating genuine victories rather than managing gradual decline. "Dr. Martinez says you're exceeding expectations for someone with your level of tissue damage." James had become his father's most constant companion during the recovery process, his mechanical skills translating surprisingly well to the adaptive techniques Bill needed to manage daily tasks with limited shoulder function. The son who'd always worshipped his father's physical strength now found himself teaching new ways to accomplish familiar tasks, their relationship deepening through shared problem-solving and mutual recognition of changed circumstances. The workshop that had once been Bill's private refuge was now a collaborative space where father and son worked together on projects scaled to match Bill's current capabilities. The elaborate furniture building that had once defined Bill's leisure time had given way to smaller craft projects that could be completed with primarily left-handed techniques, but the satisfaction of creation remained unchanged. "You know what I figured out?" James said during one of their afternoon sessions, his hands guiding a piece of sandpaper while Bill provided direction and quality control. "You taught me to use tools, but you never taught me that the most important tool is knowing when to ask for help." The master bedroom addition that had precipitated the family's crisis had been completed by a community effort that reflected the support network Bill had never realized existed around him. Veteran friends, church members, and neighbors had contributed labor and materials to finish the project, transforming what had begun as Thomas's guilt-driven gift into a symbol of collective care and community investment in the McKinley family's continued well-being. The new bedroom itself had become a sanctuary designed around Bill's physical limitations and Dorothy's caregiving needs, with grab bars disguised as decorative elements, lighting positioned to accommodate reading while lying down, and storage solutions that eliminated the need for overhead reaching. Every detail reflected thoughtful consideration of how space could support healing rather than merely house residence. Pastor Williams had become a regular visitor, his pastoral care extending beyond spiritual comfort to practical advocacy for veteran benefits and medical support. The manila envelope of military records that had revealed the origins of Bill's condition had also opened pathways to VA disability compensation that provided financial security the family had never expected to achieve. "William, I've been thinking about that conversation we had in your workshop about carrying your own weight," Pastor Williams said during one of his visits, his words careful but direct. "I think maybe we need to expand our definition of strength to include the courage to let people care about us." The Veterans Support Group that had emerged from Bill's crisis met weekly in the church fellowship hall, providing a forum for men who'd spent decades carrying invisible wounds in isolation. Bill's reluctant participation had gradually evolved into leadership of sorts, his story serving as evidence that pride could be transformed into purpose without diminishing personal dignity. "I spent 3 years slowly dying because I was afraid of being seen as weak," Bill told the group during one of their sessions, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned difficult truths through nearly fatal experience. "Turns out the strongest thing I ever did was finally letting my family love me enough to save my life." The financial stress that had initially seemed overwhelming had been mitigated by a combination of VA benefits, community fundraising, and the discovery that Bill's military service qualified him for medical coverage he'd never pursued. Dorothy's secret mortgage application had been unnecessary, replaced by disability compensation that provided more security than their retirement savings had ever offered. The grandchildren who visited on weekends found their grandfather transformed from a distant figure of patriarchal authority into an engaged presence who had time for conversations and activities that his previous schedule had never accommodated. Bill's forced retirement from construction work had created space for relationships that had been sacrificed to the demands of physical labor and financial responsibility. "Grandpa, why do you have that big scar?" asked 5-year-old Emma during one of her visits, her childish directness cutting through adult sensitivities to address the visible evidence of her grandfather's ordeal. Bill's response reflected months of learning to integrate his medical experience into a broader understanding of strength and vulnerability. "Well, sweet pea, sometimes when you're hurt, you have to let doctors help fix you. And sometimes the fixing leaves marks that remind you how strong you really are." Dorothy's garden had expanded to include raised beds that accommodated Bill's physical limitations, while providing therapeutic activity that supported his continued recovery. The vegetables they grew together fed not only their own family, but contributed to the church food pantry, transforming Bill's need for purposeful activity into service that benefited their broader community. The McKinley home had become a gathering place for other veteran families navigating their own medical and emotional challenges. Dorothy's nursing background and Bill's lived experience creating a resource for men who'd been struggling alone with conditions they'd been too proud to address through proper medical channels. As autumn arrived in Arizona, bringing relief from the brutal summer heat that had nearly claimed Bill's life, the family gathered on their completed patio for the first of what they hoped would be many years of seasonal celebrations. The master bedroom addition that had begun as compensation for emotional distance had evolved into a foundation for deeper relationships built on honesty, vulnerability, and shared commitment to supporting each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The man who'd nearly died from pride had learned to live with gratitude, and the family that had almost lost him had discovered that love expressed through action was more powerful than love held silently in the heart. Fellow Americans, Bill McKinley's story isn't just about one man's struggle. It's about all of us who've carried burdens in silence, believing that asking for help somehow diminishes the strength we've built over decades of hard work and sacrifice. How many of us have hidden our pain, our fears, our failing bodies because we were taught that real Americans handle their problems alone? Bill nearly died because he confused pride with strength, isolation with independence. But his family's love saved him, and in learning to accept help, he discovered that true courage isn't bearing suffering alone. It's allowing the people who love us to share that burden. Your children, your spouse, your friends, they're not waiting for you to be perfect. They're waiting for you to be real, to trust them with your struggles, to let them love you through your vulnerabilities. Bill's scar became a symbol of survival, not defeat. His story proves that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, healing over hiding. The master bedroom his family built together became more than an addition. It became proof that when we let others care for us, we give them the greatest gift possible, the chance to show their love through action. What fear has kept you from seeking help when you needed it most? Have you ever discovered that asking for support actually strengthened your relationships rather than weakening them? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.